Hey everyone, you're here starting with Cody and Pete, and in today's video we are working on the Bernina foot number 2 and 2A overlock foot. So this is the next video in the big book of feet. And with our overlock foot, as we can see in our book, we've got a 2 and a 2A. So the 2 is really designed for a 5.5 millimeter stitch width machine, so the foot's a little narrower. Foot 2A is a little wider to the left of the needle to accommodate a 9 millimeter stitch width machine. So it just helps feed the fabric better since our feed dogs are further apart on a 9 millimeter stitch width machine like a 570. One thing to remember is many brands have a overlock stitch foot. So this video really isn't just exclusive to Bernina. So I use my foot number 2 a lot. Because if I'm making a sample for a class, I just multiple samples, they'll get just kind of passed around just to kind of give a sample of technique or whatever. And they're going to have raw edges. I'm not going to finish off the edge, put a binding or anything like that. But I want to help prevent from fraying. So the overlock foot is going to create something similar to what an overlocker, or basically what a serger does. So it finishes off the raw edges to help prevent them from fraying. It's not going to cut the fabric or anything. You need to make sure you start off with a nice clean edge, but this stitch will give you that finish. So one thing I do a lot, so if I just have like simple quilt samples like this, so I have my nice clean cut edge. I'm not going to put binding on, I'm not going to do anything like that. But I do want to help prevent it from fraying and kind of keep all those layers together. So I'm going to put on my 2, or in this case the 2A. So here I'll take off my 1D, disengage my dual feed, and pop on my 2A foot. So one thing we can do here is we want to go to our stitch. There's a specific stitch designed for this 2A. And if we look in our big book of feet, so we've got sewing with knits, which we'll do in a second, and like finishing off seams, which is what we're about to do. So here they're showing you the stitch we're going to use, which is a very overlock stitch, which in our case is stitch number 3. So we click stitch number 3, and if we come over here in the foot selection, I can select here and say, oh look, foot number 2A. So I can go and select it. And they'll make some changes for us. So once we've selected our foot, which is suggested by the stitch, so that's all we really need to do. But I want to go back to the foot itself and the anatomy and why we're using this foot. So if we take a closer look at the foot, you see that little finger right there. So see this little finger right here? So what happens with that stitch we have selected on our screen? It overcasts over that little finger. But that little finger is open in the back. So what happens, and I've described this in other videos, is it casts over that finger, and that finger holds on to the stitch, which prevents our fabric from puckering in. And then after it takes a couple of stitches, it then is released behind the finger, and then another overcast stitch occurs. So this gives us a pretty flat overlock stitch. And also, that little finger is going to be the guide that we ride the edge of our fabric against. So let's take a closer look. So here, we're going to ride the edge of our fabric along that finger, not along the edge of the foot. It's very close, but it's not along the edge of the foot. And using that stitch, we just stitch. So here we can see we have a nice, pretty overlock stitch that basically stitch the edges together, but also is going to prevent it from fraying. This is an amazing foot. I use it all the time. It's just so wonderful. Because of the guide, because of the finger, and using that stitch is just great. So we've got some other functions we can use with this foot. Something else is stitching with knits. So here a little sample that I've got. So here I went and stitched with my number 1D to stitch it just like you would potentially stitch it on like a sewing machine, because using number 1D and using the super stretch stitch, which on this machine is stitch number 11. So I used stitch number 11, but I didn't do it that way. I went through the Creative Consultant. So let's go through the Creative Consultant and see what the machine does. Okay, so we want to sew with knit. And before we do our overlock stitch to secure the edges, we want to stitch down a straight seam. And this is something we would have done with the 1D foot or your walking foot. So what we do is we go to our Creative Consultant, go to the house, go to the little mannequin, and we will tell it we'll work with a medium weight knit. And we're going to tell it we're doing a straight stitch. We're going to stitch it down. We're not going to do an overlock stitch just yet. So we'll come here, it'll tell us needle, thread, stitch, and foot. You hit the check mark, it changes all that for us. So what it did, it changed to our stitch, it changed the tension, changed the foot, and most importantly, it changed our pressure foot pressure. And that's how we're able to sew with a stretchy knit, because we can see we'll work with a stretchy knit, but how it was nice and flat. Just like you would get with an overlocker. But that's using the super stretch stitch, which allows for that stretch so it doesn't pop. But going through the Creative Consultant, it changed a lot of things for us, including increasing our stitch length. And that's how we got that. But let's go back. We can clear that out. And let's go, and we'll prove that we're started on a straight stitch. Let's go back to our Creative Consultant and tell it we're going to do an overlock, a variable overlock. So it tells us needle, thread, stitch, and foot. Hit the check mark. It changes all that for us again. So now we've got the 2A foot on, thread tension at 3.5, pressure foot pressure at 30, dropped to 30, and it adjusted our stitch width and stitch length. So let's see what kind of result we get when we start sewing on the edge of a knit with the 2A foot. So here, let's go to our Creative Consultant. And like we've already told, we were dealing with a medium weight knit. And let's tell you we're going to do our overlock or overcast stitch, which is this one right here. And it tells us our needle, thread, stitch, and what foot we need. So if we hit the check mark, it changes everything that we need: tension, foot, pressure foot pressure, and there's our stitch. So all we're going to do now is we'll come down here. We're going to line up the edge of our fabric with that little pin, and we're going to start stitching. And here you have a beautiful overlock stitch. That's fairly flat. It's perfect. And so it allows for a nice little stretch, but finishes off the edge, just like we saw with our quilt edge. And you can do this with just regular fabric. But yeah, it's a wonderful foot that comes with many of the Bernina machines. And going through the Creative Consultant can really make it easier when you're working with it. So go play with your 2A or your number 2 foot. Finish off some simple little sample projects. It's perfect for if you sewn some garments together to kind of finish off those seams. The number 2A foot, stitch number 3, and you're good to go. All right, hopefully you enjoyed. Give the video a thumbs up and happy sewing.